Hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar where we report on the call for expression of interest dedicated to the hydrogen and CO2 markets, which we launched last June. I'd like to start by saying how grateful we are that so many of you have joined us online for today's webinar, and secondly, and most importantly, that so many of you responded to our call for expression of interest. As you'll see, your responses have shed a great deal of light on the dynamism of these sectors across our territories and will allow us to provide greater support for your projects. Today, I'm joined in reporting on the findings by Caroline de Larach, Hydrogen Projects Development Manager, and Alexis Edouin, CO2 Infrastructure Projects Development Manager. I'm Antoine Charbonnier, Manager of the Strategy, Innovation and Development Division, within which these projects are developed. In this webinar, we'll quickly go over a bit of the background and the initial objectives of this CEI. Obviously, we'll then spend some time presenting the findings. And at the end of the presentation, we'll talk about the stages we hope to go through with you to bring the first projects to fruition. Throughout our presentation, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions via the Menti platform. The codes are shown on the screen. At the end of the presentation, we'll have about 15 minutes to answer them. So, as an introduction, I'll just remind you what Teréga is. Teréga represents 80 years' experience in the development and operation of natural gas transport and storage infrastructures. We operate about 5,000 kilometers of pipelines and nearly a quarter of the national storage capacity. Like all actors in the sector, we're committed to a thorough transformation of our activities to deal with the challenges of climate change. The natural gas we transport is steadily being replaced by biomethane. And today, it's our wish to continue playing our role as a gas logistics provider in the hydrogen and CO2 markets. In those markets, there are requirements driven by economic actors, but also by strong support from the state. And that's a point on which we wanted to dwell today. Because since the CEI was launched, the state has put forward new national strategies for consultation, both on hydrogen and on CO2. The definitive version of that strategy will be published during the first half of this year, but we already know its general outline. Firstly, it confirms the ambitious targets for the two sectors by 2030. It also gives us some pointers on how these markets could be structured, particularly with significant transport needs to link the industrial hubs to one another and to link those hubs to storage infrastructures. Finally, it gives us an idea of the finance mechanisms for those projects and, more particularly where we're concerned, the principles of how infrastructures will be regulated. And one last point, those strategies offer new prospects for certain aspects, and we'd like to give you the example of white hydrogen, the hydrogen that occurs naturally in the subsoil. So, this is a subject we're following, that interests us, and it's all the more interesting because there is potential in the southwest. Because research permits have already been obtained or requested for an exploratory phase, so it's not necessarily a topic we'll spend a lot of time on today. But even so, it's something that represents a lot of potential for our company. So, looking at the objectives of this CEI, the aim for us was go beyond mere ambition and get in line with the needs of the market. For us to offer you infrastructures that meet your needs, we need to plan them over a relatively long period of time, and to do that, we need to have the most detailed vision possible of the dynamism in those markets. So, we launched the call for expression of interest to get a picture of your projects, the associated volumes and planned usage, but also to understand the associated planning and variables that could impact that planning, so that hopefully we can help you. From that point of view, We feel the CEI reached its goal. Thanks to your involvement. More than 50 of you filled submissions, giving 125 expressions of interest in total. We've taken the time to analyse those expressions of interest through a series of meetings, which has allowed us to make the distinction between partnership opportunities with research departments, equipment manufacturers, or local authorities, and projects developed by project developers or industry. There are 61 of those projects, distributed quite evenly between the two gases, hydrogen and CO2. Even so, there are 10 or so which sit right on the boundary between hydrogen, the world of hydrogen, and the world of CO2. These are decarbonization projects from industrial actors who want to decarbonize their energy consumption using hydrogen and capture the residual CO2. And equally, there are projects to recover CO2, recombining it with hydrogen to produce synthetic fuels or chemicals. Today's presentation will focus on the analysis of those 60 projects, and I'm going to hand over to Caroline to give you more detail about the hydrogen side of things. Hello everyone. I'm going to present the findings on hydrogen. For that, I propose starting with an overview of the territory, which involves analysing total hydrogen production across Teréga's territory and total consumption, including self-consumption over that same area. The aim is to analyse and assess regional dynamism around hydrogen as an energy carrier. Let's start with production. The first findings of the CEI show production of more than 668,000 tonnes in 2030, which will rise to more than 1 million tonnes in 2040. That's growth of 50%. That hydrogen production is driven by electrolysis, accounting for more than 50% in 2030. Then there's production through the importation of ammonia or methanol, which will gain the upper hand in 2040 with more than 50% of volumes. What's important to notice is that production by electrolysis in 2030 is around 400,000 tonnes. On its own, it represents 60% of the national targets given in the National Hydrogen Strategy, with the aim of 6.5 gigawatts in 2030. Now let's look at consumption. In 2030, consumption is calculated to be 330,000 tonnes, rising in 2040 to 418,000 tonnes, which is an increase of more than 25%. That consumption is mostly driven by e-fuel producers, which we'll talk about later. Finally, if we analyse production minus consumption, we see that in 2030, as in 2040, the Teréga territory will be a territory with a hydrogen surplus. These findings are very positive and very encouraging. However, you need to bear two things in mind. These values are only stated ambitions. And secondly, they will need to be adjusted in the light of project development. Indeed, there are still processes to finalise and levers to pull. There are two processes: the process of finalising land purchases and the process of finding financial partners. Finally, in terms of the levers, there are two levers: an analysis of the technical and economic suitability of some projects, which has to be finalized, and finally, an assessment of the voltage on the RTE network, which could put some production by electrolysis in doubt. Now, let's look at the producers. There are more than 17 points of production identified in this CEI. Those points of production are supported by 5 different types of actor. We have the port areas, which will produce hydrogen through importation, and port areas which will produce hydrogen by electrolysis. Next, we have energy producers, e-fuel producers, and finally, local authorities. What's important to notice is that we have a change in the actors involved over time. In 2030, production will mostly be driven by e-fuel producers. Finally, in 2040, it's the port areas that will be in the majority. Let's look at the producers. The port areas are particularly active on hydrogen. So they have production through imports of ammonia and/or electrolysis. We can see they make up 66% of those ambitions. As for e-fuel producers, they represent 30% of ambitions in 2040 with 313,000 tons. It should be noted that this production is essentially earmarked for self-consumption. And lastly, other producers account for 4% of production ambitions. Their aim is to connect to the HISO network or a network in an industrial area. Finally, all these producers hope to produce green hydrogen or decarbonized hydrogen in the longer term. The electrolysis route to decarbonized hydrogen production may rely on multiple power sources, either connecting to the electricity grid via the French energy mix, which is decarbonized, or using solar power production. And now, finally, let's look at the consumption aspect. Consumption is driven by 24 consumption points across the Teréga territory, with 4 major actors: industry, actors in mobility, energy producers, and, lastly, e-fuel producers. So, no great surprise, we see that it's e-fuel producers who will make up more than 85% of consumption. And as I said earlier, that consumption is largely taken from what they produce. Finally, industry. These are the people who come second in terms of consumption. Industry accounts for less than 10%. There's a reason. Industry has already taken steps to decarbonize, particularly with the use of energy efficiency tools or by setting up green energy production units. Hydrogen will be their ultimate tool in finalizing this decarbonization process. Their choice to factor in hydrogen will depend on the competitiveness of H2 pricing offered to them. Lastly, actors in mobility. These actors are poorly represented. And over the coming months, Teréga will go to meet those actors and mobilize them to give a clearer assessment of their needs so that they can be taken into consideration when designing network capacity. In terms of expectations, again, no great surprise. What the consumers need will be green hydrogen or decarbonized hydrogen. In terms of quality, that will vary according to usage, with 99% for fuel cells and a slightly lower quality for the world of industry. Now we're going to look at the mapping of those projects. For confidentiality reasons, we haven't shown projects on the map. However, we've split the territory into 4 areas. Areas A, B, C, and D. For each area, we've shown you the production projects, consumption projects, and mixed projects. In terms of volume, for the analysis, it's important to see that, for production, there are 3 very active areas. Areas A, C, and D. Each of those accounts for 30% of this regional production. Areas A and C, in particular, are clearly mostly driven by port areas. Now, in terms of consumption, 2 areas stand out, areas A and D, and area D in particular, which alone accounts for more than 70% of the volume consumed. What's important to note is that we therefore have a high level of dynamism around hydrogen in areas A, C, and D, which in fact corresponds to the first hydrogen network architecture as foreseen by Teréga. So, we can conclude that this first outline basically provides a good response to the initial findings of the CEI. Now we've seen how the network is located relative to needs. It's time to answer the question, is it of sufficient capacity? 2 points in answer to that. One is about the dates of commissioning, and one is about the capacity of Teréga's tools for hydrogen. Commissioning dates, the first segments of the Teréga network, shown by the blue line, will be commissioned by 2030. Concerning storage in salt caverns, the first caverns are also predicted to be commissioned by 2030. Concerning network connections with Spain, the commissioning dates are further away, and we're looking more at about 2040. Now let's move on to capacities. Concerning storage capacities, salt cavern storage capacities, our first target, will be to reach 500 gigawatt-hours. Concerning transport network capacities, we will initially take the east side from the point at Cruzy that you see here. Export capacity at the Cruzy point is 16 terawatt-hours, or 400,000 tons. And that's for 2030. We have a second point by 2040, heading north via Castillon, with a design capacity of 22 terawatt-hours per year. Now, when you analyze these storage capacities with the volumes I showed you at the start, you can see that, according to our 2030 vision, the net available volume, meaning production less consumption, is 336,000 tons. And you need to compare that with the export capacity in 2030 from Cruzy of 400,000 tons. So we see that to date, Teréga's hydrogen network is correctly sized to meet the territory's needs. Now let's look at the 2040 vision. In 2040, we have two possible export points. The proposed Cruzy one, and then the export point at Castillon. These 2 points offer an export capacity of 950,000. Those 950,000 tons should satisfy the territory's needs in 2040, but also hydrogen imports with flows of hydrogen arriving from Spain. Those volumes are not currently known, but it should be noted that the Teréga network will be designed to meet all the territory's needs and transit needs coming in from Spain. Now, I'll give you a summary of the findings and what you need to take away from this presentation about H2. We have great mobilization across all actors in the hydrogen energy carrier value chain. As you've seen, volumes are very encouraging and significant. They will justify the introduction of a collective hydrogen transport network across Teréga's territory. Teréga's territory will be a surplus territory for hydrogen, making it a net contributor to the European hydrogen backbone. Finally, in terms of the types of projects, we have a number of hydrogen hubs emerging. The sustainability of those hubs will depend on their interconnection through this collective transport network. This collective transport network will be a catalyzing network for hydrogen projects across the whole territory. Finally, the important thing to remember is that the addition of this network, its three major advantages, is the assurance of continuity of supply to industry, because we'll have many producers connected to it, and there will also be storage units present in the territory. And then the second advantage is the offer of a competitive H2 tariff, thanks to a varied offer and also thanks to transport costs that will be optimized through the pooling of costs and volumes. And then the third point is that for all hydrogen producers, and thanks to this network, we'll be offering multiple commercial openings, whether for the whole southwestern region, the whole of France, or the whole of Europe. Finally, as you've seen, hydrogen projects are clearly linked to CO2 projects, and it's with that in mind that I'll now pass you over to Alexis, who will present the findings on CO2. Yes, thank you, Caroline. Hello, everyone. First of all, we'd like to thank you for the many responses we've been able to put together on projects to do with CO2. Because I can now tell you that the findings from the CEI are representative of the first estimates we made when pre-designing the architecture of our CO2 infrastructures. As for the findings, and starting off with emissions, we decided to make a distinction between fossil fuel CO2 emissions and biogenic CO2 emissions. Just to remind you, fossil CO2 is generated from the combustion of fossil fuels such as gas, oil, and coal, or generated from chemical reactions that intrinsically give off CO2. And that's particularly the case in the cement and steel industries. Biogenic CO2, meanwhile, is generated from organic matter, biomass, or different biological processes. Concerning the results, we gathered 19 responses about capturable CO2 emission projects. Fossil CO2 emitters responded, particularly cement works, and plants producing lime or other industrial processes generating incompressible residual CO2. For biogenic CO2, we gathered many responses from the timber industry, particularly pyrogasification projects, but also projects from paper mills. We've also gathered projects from fermentation processes, which is particularly the case with methanization plants, but also bioethanol production plants. On the other hand, we feel one industry is not necessarily well represented in the findings this year, and that's the waste processing industry, particularly where there are energy recovery units or incinerators, for which we received no responses. At the global level, the potential capturable CO2 emissions across the territory are 1.7 million tonnes of CO2 per year from 2030 and up to 3 million tonnes of CO2 in 2040, with a large proportion of biogenic, more than half. This clearly highlights the territory's advantages in terms of biogenic CO2 emissions. And this territory is different from other industrial hubs with a large proportion of fossil CO2. And alongside that, for information about fossil CO2 across the territory, we've been able to flag up storage needs for these local industries. We should point out that as a part of this CEI, we also talked to the different ports in our territory, particularly Bordeaux and Bayonne, enabling us to foresee the import or export of additional CO2 by sea to be added to the emissions I've just mentioned. For consumption, we received 8 responses. 2 responses are to do with the direct consumption of CO2, particularly in agricultural greenhouses. We also gathered numerous responses from the developers of projects to reuse CO2 for the production of e-fuels or e-molecules for the green chemicals industry. Note that this industry's requirements are basically for biogenic CO2. The global results reveal the potential to reuse 1.7 million tonnes of CO2 per year by 2030 and nearly 2.2 million tonnes in 2040. We quickly see that biogenic CO2 requirements for reuse are greater than emissions. This highlights a very proactive strategy by CO2 recovery project developers, a still emerging industry, but clearly a source of reindustrialization of the territories. Moving on to the map of emissions and reuse projects, as with hydrogen, we haven't shown project locations for confidentiality reasons. Generally speaking, we could see that emissions are distributed right across the territory, but not necessarily very evenly. So we highlighted 2 very active areas in terms of capturable CO2. This is particularly the case with Area G on the Mediterranean coast, up to the planned storage site in Béarn, which has strong capture potential from 2030. We're talking about 800,000 tonnes of fossil CO2 and 800,000 tonnes of biogenic CO2 per year. Note that biogenic CO2 in this area makes up 75% of capturable CO2 emission potential in 2030. Area E also represents considerable capture potential, but more after 2030, with high biogenic CO2 capture potential of nearly 1 million tonnes of CO2 from 2040. In other areas, F and H, in this instance, we identified a few emitters, but capture potential is quite low, below 200,000 tonnes of CO2 per year and per area. As for foreseeable CO2 import and export, naturally these projects are located on the Atlantic seaboard around the ports of Bayonne and Bordeaux. When it comes to consumption and reuse, we noticed that 3 areas were very active. Those areas are quite similar to the CO2 emission areas where projects are developed directly close to emissions. This is the case with areas E, G, and H. Note that in 2040, the highest potential for reuse is in area G, with more than 50% of the reuse potential. What we can say generally about these findings is that the architecture of future CO2 infrastructures is quite in line with the territory's needs, as much in terms of timing as in terms of geographical distribution. And so it's the route of our future infrastructures that you can see in blue on the map. In conclusion, on the overall findings of this CEI, we can say that the CCUS is still an emerging industry. The projects fed back to us are still in the feasibility study phase and require further development. Having said that, we have certainly been able to highlight the need for infrastructures, by 2030 in fact, for decarbonizing industry, but also for the development of the CO2 reusage industries. Of course, those infrastructures will be able to rely on the skills and resources of the Southwest, which I highlighted just a moment ago, particularly the significant biogenic CO2 deposit, access to the sea, and onshore storage capacities opening up across the territory. Those infrastructures will allow the regions of Nouvelle-Aquitaine and Occitanie to be models in terms of energy transition and decarbonization in the territories. I now propose handing you back to Antoine for the next part. Thank you, Alexis, and thank you, Caroline, for presenting these findings. As you all have seen, we now need to exploit these findings to catalyze your projects. So, 2024 will be a year devoted to the consolidation of our logistics offer. We're going to adapt the architecture of hydrogen and CO2 transport, distribution, and storage infrastructure projects to match up supply with demand, and also try to get the most out of the synergies between the hydrogen and CO2 industries. This will be a prerequisite for launching feasibility studies and working on the terms for financing these infrastructures, whether by seeking out subsidies at the French or European level, or by developing regulation mechanisms which will, on the one hand, support the development of infrastructures, but also govern the rules on commercialization. And then, in 2025, we hope to enter into a contractualization phase with you to confirm needs and confirm the commitment of each of the parties in the development of the first projects on the ground. That's the schedule we hope we can embark on together. The CEI is just a starting point, and we still have a lot of things to do to accelerate the development of these projects. So, those are the big messages we wanted to put across in this little presentation. We now have about 15 minutes to answer the questions sent in via the Menti platform. But first, if we don't get the chance to answer all the questions, we'll try to do it later via the Teréga website. Our first question is about the presentation. Firstly, the webinar is being recorded, so you'll have access to the video. And on top of that, I think we'll be able to share the presentation content via our website. Caroline, a question about hydrogen. Do you have several areas and types of hydrogen storage, or just a salt cavern? At the moment, Teréga is mainly working on storage in salt caverns. There are 2 targets, one set at 500 gigawatt-hours, and one a bit further off, set at 1 terawatt-hour. For each of those targets, there are several salt caverns. As a tool, it's modular, flexible, and able to adapt to the needs of the market. So that's the first storage being studied. After that, there are also studies going on into the conversion of Teréga's storage facilities. But that conversion is further away, and those storage facilities must first be used to deal with methane supply needs. So, we have two types of storage. By 2030, generally salt cavern storage, and then looking further ahead, we'll have two other Teréga storage facilities. We have a question about CO2. How do you distinguish between biogenic and fossil CO2? How do you track these types of CO2 through your pipelines? There's no big physical difference between biogenic CO2 and fossil CO2. They're both injected into the same pipeline. Having said that, there will be tracking via guarantees of origin, just as you might find with biomethane, in the natural gas network or green electricity in electricity grids. So you have certificates and guarantees of origin. Caroline, a question about hydrogen and its competitiveness. You say hydrogen will be competitive. What price are the projects showing? For now, the level of maturity of the projects doesn't allow us to answer that question. However, the aim is to get as close as possible to the price of methane, so that it's worth considering for industry. So, at this stage, none of the project owners has been able to give us a price point for this hydrogen. We have a second question about CO2. Do you foresee being able to capture CO2 directly from the air using DAC or direct air capture? Actually, there's been talk about plans to capture CO2 from industry, particularly from industrial fumes. CO2 is also present in the air, and it is possible, using this technology, to collect it. However, that's not something that Teréga would do directly. But in any case, we're open to any new proposed connection to our future CO2 infrastructures. I should say that we haven't yet received any approaches of that kind via this CEI. So, watch this space. Another question about hydrogen. What would be the benefits of this planned storage in salt caverns? There are many benefits from storage in salt caverns. Hydrogen storage will be an answer to security of supply, which is very important for industry, which is a driver for choosing this energy carrier. It will enable us to secure all those supplies. And then, in the event that consumers need to pause their operations, it will allow producers to continue producing and store it in these storage areas so that it can be sold at a later date. That's also important. And finally, the storage tools will enable us to have what we refer to as reduction periods, meaning producers will be able to adjust their production for the purpose of balancing the network. Lastly, this tool will also be a balancing tool in respect of intermittent green energy production. So we have 4 advantages from this salt cavern storage. Is it possible to take part in this CEI or change the figures we've sent in once it's finished? Absolutely. You can still take part in this CEI, or at least get in touch with us to discuss your projects. At the end of the presentation and slides, we'll show you the email address you can use to contact us to discuss them. Because quite clearly, we remain open to all approaches from the market.
À toutes les sollicitations du marché.
Looking at the level of participation, we received a total of 125 submissions, 125 responses. And those responses cover both partnership proposals from people or companies wanting to contribute the development of our projects on our customers' projects. These were chiefly research departments or equipment manufacturers. And then the other half of submissions were project presentation files. So, in total, 61 projects were presented among the expressions of interest. Nearly 34, as I said, were just to do with hydrogen production and consumption projects. 27 were to do with CO2 capture. And then, between the two, there were 9 projects put forward by project developers or industrial actors wanting either to develop projects to reuse CO2 by recombining hydrogen to produce synthetic fuels or chemicals, or industrial actors wanting, on the one hand, to remove the fatal CO2 from their plant, and on the other hand, to replace fossil energy consumption with hydrogen consumption. We have a question about the average size of capture projects. Capture projects depend on the size of projected emissions. These projects extend from a few tens of thousands of tons per year to several hundreds of thousands of tons per year, and even as much as 1 million tons of CO2 per year. Capture projects are on average for a few 100,000 tons per year. The median is around 500,000 tons of CO2 per year. A question about the quality of gas relating to CO2. What is your specification in terms of the quality of gas required from emitters? How will it be checked? Gas quality is a vast topic. First of all, the CO2 will be dehydrated to prevent any risk of condensation in the pipelines, leading to a potential risk of corrosion to the steel making up the pipelines, or the formation of hydrates, which could damage the pipelines. As for the other impurities associated with CO2, the standard is being worked out, and so the impurity content is still to be defined. What we can say is that whatever happens, the CO2 must have a purity of more than 95%. And how will it be checked? Well, in the end, there will be analyzers in place at the injection sites in the pipelines. So, we have a question about how the HYSO project sits in relation to the BARMAR project. The BARMAR project, for those who don't know, is a project we're co-developing with 3 other partners aimed at developing a hydrogen transport pipeline from Barcelona to Marseille. Quite clearly, there are links between the HYSO project and the BARMAR project. The HYSO project, which aims to serve the needs of the southwest area, could, depending on the situation, be connected to BARMAR via the industrial port of Port-la-Nouvelle in the Occitanie region, or be directly connected by BARMAR where the pipeline reaches Marseille. Great! Thank you for your questions. Once again, if you have any additional questions, there's an opportunity for us to answer them. Simply contact us at the address which will be shown at the end of the presentation. And to reiterate, the webinar will be available on the internet, so you can watch it there. Thank you once again for joining us online to listen to this report on the findings of the CEI. We hope this is just the first step in working together to develop hydrogen and CO2 infrastructure projects. Thank you, and bye for now.